On today's show, we will dive into some way too early predictions for the Central Division. We'll talk about which teams will be competing for the top 3 spots, which teams are on the fringe, could be top 3, could be wildcard teams, and then we'll talk about the teams that will likely miss the postseason in 2023. All coming up on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily in-season podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Wednesday, July 27th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener of the show, thank you for stopping by and for making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube. Help us get to 600 subscribers before the start of August. You can also find and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. Thank you guys again for tuning in, despite us cutting back to 3 episodes a week for the remainder of the offseason. Remember, we will be uploading Monday, Wednesday, Friday from now up until the start of training camp, which will be in late September. But let's get into today's talking points, which of course are some very early, way too early, in fact, Central Division standing projections. You guys really did enjoy the way too early lineup projections that we did a while back earlier this offseason, and so I wanted to do the same thing for the Central Division. We've already talked about who's been added, to what teams, who's departed what teams, but now I want to take a moment and actually kind of give a view of what I think the standings could look like in this division. It might not be the most competitive division in the NHL this season, but there are, several teams. I think the greater majority of the teams in this division still provide a ton of intrigue and will be competing for playoff positioning late into the season, as we saw in this previous installment of NHL hockey. And of course, I want to start out with the top 3, or the teams I think will be in the top 3 of the division. So we will be going in order, working our way from top to bottom throughout the duration of today's episode. And of course, starting with number 1, the team I think that will win the division, probably one of the safest bets outside of some of the teams that will be near the bottom of the division. I think the Colorado Avalanche should be favorites to win the Central Division again. And the main reason why, it feels pretty self-explanatory, but in case you haven't kept up with some of the moves this offseason, or for Colorado, lack thereof, they still have the majority of their key pieces intact. They're not the exact same team. There are some new faces, and there are a few names that have departed, but they've kept the guys on the roster, and will have them back that were huge throughout the regular season and were detrimental to their success in the postseason. Nathan MacKinnon, Cale Makar, Gabriel Landeskog, Mikko Rantanen, and even some of the role players that are going to stick around will be beneficial for them this season. And Val Nichushkin, Arturi Lehkonen, Josh Manson, Eric Johnson, the list could go on and on. Even guys like Andrew Cogliano, Dallas Stars legend Andrew Cogliano, coming back for at least one more season with the Avs to try to go back-to-back, similar to what we saw the Tampa Bay Lightning do in 2020 and 2021. Really, the only question you could say with this Colorado team is their goaltending situation, because Darcy Kuemper, as we know, has departed for the Washington Capitals, and he will be replaced by Alexander Georgiev, a goalie coming from the New York Rangers. He was Igor Shesterkin's backup this past season, and not too bad of a goalie. Career numbers for him, 2.94 goals against average and a .908 save percentage. This is a young guy. Like I said, he was backing up the best goaltender in the NHL last season, so he's kind of looking for his opportunity to finally get to be the guy, and what better opportunity than a team that is looking to go back-to-back in pursuit of another Stanley Cup. So it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for Georgiev, but is he going to have the same success that Kuemper had, even though Kuemper had far from the most efficient season as far as goalies go in the NHL, but he did well enough for this team to eventually win the entire playoff bracket. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Certainly not a bad situation that's going to completely lower this team a few pegs. They're still going to be very, very good. And barring any injury, I would say be prepared for the Avalanche to win the division pretty safely. And maybe even we could see them compete for the President's Trophy. I really do think that they have a shot to do that, barring, again, injuries or just another team in the West or in the Central Division coming absolutely out of nowhere, which I don't really predict. But coming in at second place in my way too early Central Division rankings, I have the St. Louis Blues, who are also primed for another excellent season after an early playoff exit in the second round to the eventual Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche. And I think a huge reason for this is they have a number of guys on the last year of their contracts, and they will be playing extremely hard to earn another contract once their current deals expire, because a lot of these guys, some of them earlier on in their career, but some of them kind of in the middle, where this might be their last chance to get that massive long-term contract. And whether it's going to be with St. Louis or with another team, you best believe that these guys will be giving it their all on the ice for this club night in and night out. Their captain, Ryan O'Reilly, Vladimir Tarasenko, Jordan Kyrou will be an RFA. He was in big trade talks for Matthew Tkachuk at one point before that deal with Florida went down. Ivan Barbashev, and those are just a few of the guys that will be up for new deals at the end of this season. And they also have a solid lineup and not a whole lot of holes on this roster. One of the biggest storylines for them this offseason has been Robert Thomas getting extended. He had 77 points last season and will be with the St. Louis Blues, I believe, until the end of the 2030-2031 season. He is locked in for a long time with this club, and a guy that I think kind of maybe flies under the radar under some of the other names that I just read that have been more long-tenured Blues. But even other players like Pavel Buchnevich, he was a 30-goal scorer for them last season. Justin Falk, one of their defensemen, had 16 goals from the blue line last season, which is really impressive. Really anything double digits for goals is impressive for me, and I'm sure for many other Stars fans as well, given the lack of scoring we saw from our defensemen this past season. But they just have talent all over this roster, including in net, where, of course, Jordan Binnington will be coming back for another campaign with the Blues. And the Blues, just overall, one of the more underrated teams last season. They were third in goals for last season at 309, and they gave the Avs the most trouble in the playoffs, at least in the Western Conference. You could argue that the Lightning gave them a decent amount of trouble in the final, but when it came to their series leading up to the Stanley Cup Finals, St. Louis certainly was the team that gave them the most issues, and I think caused them to stumble the most, because they just blew through Nashville and Edmonton. But St. Louis, they had to stop a little bit and, kind of work their way to get past that round. So they are certainly not a team to be slept on this season just because they were eliminated in the second round. Had they played anyone else in that second round, I think that they could have found their way to the conference finals, where they might have eventually still been bested by the Avalanche. But this is a very competitive team that has a lot of really nice young and old pieces on it. And so I expect them to very certainly be in the top three of this division, along with my third pick, the Dallas Stars. And I could be going out on a limb there. Nashville and Minnesota fans, if you somehow found your way to this podcast, take your shenanigans elsewhere. You can leave your mean comments, your comments saying I don't know anything. I mean, you can leave them here all you want, but this is a Dallas Stars podcast. What did you expect? You think I'm going to put them out of the playoff picture or out of the top three? And I'm not just doing it because I am a Dallas Stars podcaster or a Dallas Stars fan. I truly believe that this is possible. And the big reason because of that is because Pete DeBoer teams seemingly overachieve in their first season under his leadership. I'm not saying it's a shoo-in for the Stars to make a cup run, but just given Pete DeBoer's history, we've seen the New Jersey Devils, the Knights, the Sharks all do exceptionally well under Pete DeBoer's leadership in their first season, and I haven't seen anything to prove why that trend won't continue this season. And Dallas, at moments, were they were competitive for one of the top three spots in the division last season, but just due to some of their own mistakes and shooting themselves in the foot at times, losing games they shouldn't have lost, kept knocking themselves down a peg to be a wild card team, but they did end up with that first wild card spot. But I think we'll also, and of course part of this is due in part to Pete DeBoer coming to Dallas, I think we will see an uptick in offensive numbers, which should work in favor for this team in terms of where they place in a playoff series in the first round. And of course, plenty of other players like St. Louis in Dallas that will be looking to get big contracts either in the middle of this season or next summer. Rope Hintz, Dennis Gurianov, Luke Glendening, Jacob Peterson, maybe Joe Pavelski, who is going to be playing on a new one-year deal this season in Dallas? Will he be playing more hockey after that this season? Will likely be a determining factor in that. I'm not going to talk too much more about the Stars because we talk about them on this show all the time, but I expect them to have a very strong season with improved offensive numbers led by stellar goaltending with Jake Ottinger, hopefully the reemergence of that top line, and hopefully a more capable offense that can help propel them to more wins in the regular season, thereby giving them better seeding in the playoffs. Well, coming up next, we will talk about a handful of teams that will likely still make the postseason, whether they sneak into the third spot at the top of the division or whether they grab one of the Western Conference wildcard spots. We'll talk about some of the fringe top of the division teams after a quick break. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs and sports info. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live betting, in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. Moving on today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for making us your first listen of the day. We're talking about two teams that I think very well could make the postseason this coming season for the NHL, and two teams that very well could compete for a top 3 spot. I talked about Nashville and Minnesota fans if they somehow found this episode that they think that their team very well could compete, and they could. But I just think the Dallas Stars, given their coaching hire and what that means for that team as a entire unit, I think that will help them take that next step potentially to being a probably third place team in the Central Division. Now, with that said, these next two teams, Minnesota and Nashville, will be pretty good teams. They'll be very competitive teams, and I will not be shocked at all if they make the postseason, whether it's a top 3 spot or a wild card spot. But I see them more realistically grabbing wild card spots. And we'll start with the Minnesota Wild. They're going to be a good team, but I just don't know if they've gotten any better this offseason. This is a team that was very, very good, very competitive, maybe seemed like they had a chance to win the Central Division early on last season before Colorado finally kind of caught fire and really became the team we knew that they were going to be. But, they still, I think, took a lot of people by surprise in the regular season, had a fantastic 82-game stretch, and then things just kind of came to a screeching halt for them in the postseason against the Blues in round 1. And for this Wild team, I think it all starts in net for them. Marc-Andre Fleury, of course, one of the best goalies in recent memory, probably the best goalie of my generation, quote unquote. Just an incredible storied player, but he's 37 years old. And we see time and time again, Father Time is undefeated when it comes to the world of sports, and that is certainly no exception to goalies. We see every single season these goalies that reach their mid to late 30s and their bodies start to wear down, injuries just overcome them, or surgery, something gets in the way of a goalie that was once fantastic being that player that we know that they've been in the past. So I'm not saying Marc-Andre Fleury is due for a bad season, but I would be very, very cautious going in with him as the number one option, because with this Minnesota team especially, if he fails or if he gets injured or if he's not performing to the expectations that the team has for him, your backup is kind of a really uncertain situation in an unproven Philip Gustafsson from Ottawa, who has not had a very good start to his career. He does have some upside, and again, he is a very young player who, again, I said unproven because he hasn't been in the NHL for very long, and I'm sure that playing in the same organization and on the same team as a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury will be very beneficial for Gustafsson going forward, but he's unproven. And as of right now, is certainly not a viable option as a number one goalie for a team like Minnesota that is hoping to be competitive for a playoff spot. And then, of course, another factor in this is the now absence of Kevin Fiala. He was second on the Wild this last season in points at 85, and he is now in Los Angeles with the Kings. And that's not to say that they don't have a plethora of talent on the roster, like 108-point scorer Kirill Kaprizov, Zuccarello, Hartman, Eriksson Ek. They have a good team, but this is pretty much the same team that made the playoffs last year and lost to the St. Louis Blues in round one, minus their second scorer of points and minus Cam Talbot. And now it just doesn't seem like, at least at the time of recording this, that the Minnesota Wild have done a whole lot to get better or to prove to us that they're ready to take that next step from, being a kind of a disappointing first round exit to being a team that can compete in the second and third round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. I just personally have not seen it, but of course we'll just have to see how things play out with this team come the regular season. But at the time of recording this, at the time being, I just don't see them being the team that they were last season. I think they maybe take 1 or 2 steps back rather than 1 or 2 steps forward. And now the team that was the hardest for me to predict in Nashville. I mean, this is Dallas's biggest rival, so of course it's always going to be difficult for me to want to place them higher up in the rankings, but this is another team that had a very nice start last season and then started to fall off a little bit. The wheels started falling off as the season kind of got to its conclusion. They squeak into the playoffs and then go out of the playoffs with nothing more than a whimper, just getting obliterated by the Colorado Avalanche. Of course, they did not have their star goalie in UC Saros in net. But this is a team that, similar to Minnesota, is bringing back a very similar core to last season. Philip Forsberg, one of the surprises of the offseason, is coming back to Nashville. The captain, Roman Josi, Matt Duchene, Johansson, Saros. I mean, these are guys that have been staples of this Preds team for quite some time now. And, of course, they did add a pretty nice addition this offseason with Nino Niederreiter from the Carolina Hurricanes. I think that he will add a new dynamic to their offense and make them a more explosive offensive team. And they also added defenseman Ryan McDonough from the Tampa Bay Lightning, who scored 26 points last season. Great veteran presence, a guy that has been with this Tampa Bay team for the past handful of seasons, been to all 3 Stanley Cup appearances with them in the past 3 campaigns. So they've done some really nice things this offseason to add to the roster. I think that maybe they could even finish above Minnesota. I go back and forth with Minnesota and Nashville, who I think might be the superior team, or which team could finish higher in the standings. But I've liked some of the moves that Nashville did, as much as I hate to compliment something that the Nashville Predators are doing. But really, outside of the additions to this team, I think those will help make them competitive and make them a better team on paper. I think that this team will go as far as UC Saros takes them. And we saw that in the playoffs a few months ago when they, like I said, got absolutely wiped out by the Colorado Avalanche because, okay, they didn't have their star goaltender in net, but they still had all of these weapons in Josi, in Forsberg, Duchene, Johansson. I mean, and of course they didn't have Niederreiter or McDonough at the time, but they still had some really nice pieces on the team that it wasn't even enough for them to win a game. You think that maybe they could have squeaked out a game at home in their own arena, but it just wasn't possible. And again, I know that Colorado team, one of the best teams we've seen in the postseason in the past several years. Very, very difficult to win a playoff game like that when you're missing one of the heart and soul pieces of your team. But still, I just don't know the moves that Nashville made, I like the moves that they made. I think they will be a competitive team. They always play really close and competitive against the Stars. The Stars open their first 2 games of the season against Nashville. They'll play in Tennessee, and then they'll come right back and play them in Texas. And those are going to be exciting games, and we'll get a true taste of what both teams are made of early on in the season. And I'm very excited to watch this rivalry take on a new chapter in 2022-2023. Well, coming up next, we will talk about the teams that I imagine will be on the outside of the playoff picture looking in, and some teams that will likely be gunning for the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 NHL draft. We'll round out the way too early Central Division standing projections after a quick break. Closing out today's Wednesday episode of Locked On Stars, we were talking about the final 3 teams in my way too early Central Division standing predictions, starting with the Winnipeg Jets. And this is a team that is kind of borderline for me, a team that I almost put into the fringe category because they kind of were on the fringe last season of making the playoffs, but then kind of teetered off with a team like the Vancouver Canucks and the Vegas Golden Knights as the season finally drew to a close. I almost put them in the wildcard category, but due to an overwhelming amount of teams that I think will be competing for playoff spots out in the West, both in the Central and the Pacific. I decided to put the Jets in this category, and I do think that they will miss out on the playoffs in 2023. However, they are bringing back Pierre-Luc Dubois, which is huge for them. A few weeks ago when we talked about this team, it seemed like he might be going off to Montreal or somewhere else to play and seemed disinterested in playing for the Jets, but now they hold on to him, which is huge. They still have Kyle Connor, Blake Wheeler, Mark Scheifele, Connor Hellebuck. They still have some really good pieces on this Winnipeg team. However, there have been reports over this past season and for however long now that there's, kind of a toxic culture, toxic locker room around this Jets organization. But I imagine that the addition of Rick Bowness as head coach will help eliminate some, if not all, of that. We've known here in Dallas that Rick Bowness, regardless of how you feel about his coaching style, as far as gameplay and game plan, he is a guy that can control his locker room and gain the respect of his players and make his team gel as an actual team and make them, not necessarily make them get along with one another, but form a culture that is, uplifting and guys that like to play for one another, guys that have each other's back. I think that Rick Bowness will be huge for the Winnipeg Jets in helping enforce that kind of culture. And with that said, we do know also what Rick Bowness brings to the table as far as just the way that he coaches his teams. This will be an incredibly physical Winnipeg Jets team, and it won't be easy to get a win against them. I think that they might find themselves in the middle of the pack of the NHL standings, but they're still going to be a team that you have to bring your A game, especially physically, night in and night out against them. I just don't think they will stack up well against some of the other teams that will likely be competing for wildcard spots, especially some Pacific teams, because I think the Pacific Division could kind of be a little messy this season. I think LA and Edmonton are surefire playoff berth teams, but then the rest of the Pacific, who knows what Calgary's going to look like? Who knows what Vegas is going to look like? Vancouver had a really nice second half of the season last year. I just think there's going to be too many good teams competing for wildcard spots in the West that Winnipeg might be one of the odd men out. So I still expect them to be competitive. They still have some really good pieces. We know that Rick Bowness is going to get the most out of that group that he can. I just don't see them in making the playoffs in what will be a crowded Western Conference. Moving on to the 7th place team. I actually think the Arizona Coyotes will finish 7th and not 8th, although them and Chicago could probably replaced, flip-flopped, whatever you want to call it, just like Minnesota and Nashville. Arizona, as we know, as we've talked about, they're still a team that is likely going to be at the bottom of the Central Division standings, Western Conference standings, and the NHL standings as a whole. But, I think if you're an Arizona fan, this is something that is disappointing now, but to know that your team is fully embracing the rebuild and not trying to pass off a team that is okay or fine with where they're at, I think that should bring some semblance of hope. I mean, things are certainly not great for that organization right now, but if things continue to quote unquote go well and the Coyotes are able to acquire these high draft picks and get these really, really good young prospects, I don't think there's any reason why they can't be a competitive team again in the next 3 to 5 years. Clayton Keller is still the guy in Arizona as of right now on the NHL roster. They went out and added Zach Kassian from the fresh off a Western Conference Finals appearance with the Edmonton Oilers. They have a guy like Nick Schmaltz, Jacob Chikrin, Shane Gostisbehere. It seems like Phil Kessel will be gone, but they still kind of have these pieces of some of these younger guys, but guys that are younger, but also have a few years of NHL experience under their belt. Guys that will be good to have alongside some of these other guys that are either on entry-level contracts, guys that will be making their NHL debuts. Definitely not a team that will be gunning for a playoff spot, but I mean, a lot of these young guys, they just have to get their NHL experience somewhere. They have to be able to cut their teeth somewhere, and Arizona just happens to be that place for them. But they've also gone out and drafted 3 picks in the first round back in Montreal a few weeks ago, and they're hoping that these guys will help be the future backbone, the cornerstones of this team. If they are eventually going to be playoff competitors, it's hopefully going to kind of be with Clayton Keller, with the guys that they took in the first round, like Cooley, I believe at 3rd overall in the 2022 draft. So the future seemingly could be bright in Arizona. It's not going to be very bright this season, but they gave Dallas a little bit of trouble in some of their games last season. And that just tends to happen. You'll have those games where the bad teams of the NHL will come out and have a really good night. And we saw that happen a handful of times with the Stars. They lost to New Jersey. They lost to Arizona. They lost to Montreal one time at home. So not saying that the Stars are going to get a sweep, but don't expect Arizona to be competing for a playoff spot this season. Same can be said for the Chicago Blackhawks, who seemingly blew just about everything up this season. Gone are Alex DeBrincat, Dylan Strome, Kirby Dach, Kubalik is gone. Really, the only known pieces that have been with the Blackhawks for a while that are still there, Taves, Canes, Jones, they're still around, but those three are not going to be enough to propel this team to a playoff berth. I think this is a team similar to Arizona that if they do things right and they fully embrace the rebuild, that they can probably be competitive in the next 4 to 5 years as well. They did go out and add a few players like Max Domi, Colin Blackwell, Andreas Athanasiou. Those guys went and signed with the team. Again, I think this is just them going to get these guys to fill roster spots, but I don't expect the Blackhawks to be making any sort of big jump, and I certainly think that they will be looking to gun for that first overall pick. Seemingly, Connor Bedard kind of seems to be the consensus first overall pick in next year's draft. Arizona, Chicago, as well as maybe some other teams like Montreal, will be competing to get that first overall pick, because for the little I know about Connor Bedard, he seems to be like a generational type player that could really be a franchise altering type player. So Blackhawks also in rebuild mode. I know last year they went out and got Marc-Andre Fleury, and there was maybe this idea of maybe the Blackhawks will be decent and they'll maybe sneak into the playoffs, and that just absolutely did not happen. But now they've gotten rid of a ton of really good pieces to build around, like Alex DeBrincat, which I get why they got rid of him, but also that's a guy that I would have loved to have kept on the team to maybe try to build around, but what's done is done. He is off to Ottawa, and the Ottawa Senators, by the way, not Western Conference, not Central Division. I think they will be a sneaky good team this season. But Chicago, not going to be a very good team this season. I expect them to be like Arizona, where they're going to give some teams some trouble. A few nights a season, they'll get some wins they probably shouldn't. They'll beat some teams that are at the top of the NHL that should be getting those wins, but that's just how the world of professional sports works. I know that even against Dallas, all the games they played against them were pretty competitive, but I think Dallas, will be the better team most times when they do meet up this season, and Dallas should hopefully be able to get the majority of the wins against some of these teams like Winnipeg, Arizona, and Chicago, and they're going to need all the points they can get if they want to finish in that top 3 spot in the Central Division. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube how you see the Central Division shaking out this season. We'll, of course, bring up this topic again as we get closer to the start of the regular season, because there might be some new additions to teams, could be some injuries, other breaking developments that could change how I or you or anyone else perceive the standings shaping out in the Central Division. Be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube as well as on your favorite podcasting platform, whether that be Spotify or Apple. You can also find and follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show at Locked On Stars. Be on the lookout on Twitter for the tweets about a Friday mailbag episode. You can send in your mailbag questions to the Locked On Stars Twitter page as well as the YouTube community tab. Be sure to submit your questions there for a chance to have your question featured on Friday's episode. But we will see you there, Stars fans. Have a great Wednesday.